And, like not installed, but like supported. Many schools were founded, and with those schools came rich awqaf that gave scholars and students the opportunity to study and to learn and to get money from this. They could live there, they could stay there. Some madaris had a kitchen, so they were also provided by food, etc., and housing. And this was very convenient for scholars who had to leave their home and then find another in Damascus. The political patronage in Syria supported this. And during the reign of the Ayyubid sultans, there is also a shift that we can see from a more, sources say, or studies say, a more plural or plural approach in terms of religious politics done by Al-Malik Kamil, who supported all kinds of religious movements, especially rationalist-oriented scholars. But with the reign of Al-Ashraf Musa, there is a tendency to support traditionalist views, and those traditionalist views express themselves in a tendency of anti-rational policies. There is a ban of study and teaching philosophy and logic in the Damascene schools. There's an immigration movement from rationalist scholars who left Damascus because of those tendencies and moved to Cairo, where they could do their rationalist scholarship, continue their rationalist scholarship. This is still an open question whether those migrated scholars and who often had a traditionalist outview, or at least adjusted to the traditionalist climate, whether they were in contrast with the scholarly elite, the local scholarly elite, which would be mostly Shafi'i scholars who had a strong Ash'ari orientation, and some Hanbalis as well there. The bigger intellectual climate or changes also, which can we observe in this time, is that there is a stronger emphasis on the veneration of the Prophet. Not only can we see an increase in Mawlid celebrations, but also relics of the Prophet were installed in specific schools. They were like the sandal of the Prophet, or the Prophet's hair, or the footprints of the Prophet were stored in schools and other teaching or religious institutions in Damascus, and they were also often placed strategically, architecturally, in a strategic place. So we have, for example, the two sandals of the Prophet placed in two madrasas, into schools that were on the opposite side of the road you would take to enter the citadel, for example. So you pass through, or you pass the sandals of the Prophet while entering the citadel, visiting the Ayyubid princes. And those probably can be seen as an attempt by the Zengids and Ayyubids to counter attack the Fatimid tendencies in Damascus by that time. So they supported the veneration of the Prophet, the relics of the Prophet, and with that, a popularization of hadith readings can be seen. There's an installment of Dur al-Hadith, which were, I think, in that period, the first time that someone would actually built or found a Dar al-Hadith. Nowadays, it's like common sense that there is Dur al-Hadith, but actually we don't really know what, if, for example, in the Ottoman period, what kind of knowledge there was read there. For the Ayyubid period, we can say at least that they were used to held public readings of Hadith collections, and those Hadith collections often related like to the political climate. During the Zengid time, the jihad collections were read to like mobilize the local popularity against the Crusades, but also the Fatimids. Another trend is that we have to keep in mind is that Muslims in this city at that time were at least on the brink to become a majority in the city. This is not something we should take for granted. In many cities, even cities like Baghdad or others, Muslims tend to stay or be a minority till the 12th or 13th century. But now we have the fact that many scholars come to Damascus. There is a very dense network of schools in the center of the city. If you see a map of that, like every other building is a school. There's money to support scholarship, and they don't really have, if they don't want to, they don't have to engage with non-Muslims, so they can further a specialization discourse which is entirely like inner Muslim, inner Islamic. In this climate, we can see an emergence of a Damascene traditionalism, and this traditionalism expresses itself, I've already said that, in a tendency to at least criticize or to criticize rationalism. It's an attempt to exclude the Greek philosophy out of the Islamic tradition or the Islamic thinking or reasoning. And that was driven, at least I thought so, mostly by Shafi'i and Hanbali scholars who migrated from Iraq. And they might have been, the sources don't give that really away, or at least not a clear picture. I believe that those migrated Shafi'i scholars who got the patronage of the Ayyubid Sultan Al-Ashraf Musa might have been also in opposition to the Damascene Shafi'i families such as Ibn Asakir and Ibn Sasra, who are actually known for their Ash'ari tendencies, but by taking or maintaining the position, a traditionalist position, that was a means for migrated scholars also to get teaching positions and to make a name for themselves. Same is true for the migrated Hanbali community, the Ibn Qudama family, who settled in the Salhiyya. They were very active. They also commuted frequently to the old city of Damascus. You must imagine the Umayyad Mosque as one of the biggest mosques in Damascus had 4 corners or 4 places where the 4 law schools had teaching circles. So they came to Damascus, to the old city, and they would sit at least in the same shared space, although sitting by themselves. But through this is one of my hypotheses, they created a climate where students could easily go and listen to ideas of other scholars. And there's a tendency, and this is also the basic original initial idea of this paper and my research right now. There's a tendency that in creed, like in Islamic belief, and in Islamic law, that ideas of unify or find a common language in those disciplines in that period. And this is reflected in the fact that students, for example, Shafi'i students, would read Maliki Mukhtasar works or Hanbali Mukhtasar works. It is reflected in the fact that people would refer to the Sahihain or the six, I don't want to say canonical, the six like great or larger hadith collection became common references to which they refer when they cite hadith, which is not a, like, we shouldn't take this fact also for granted. Behind the canonization process, or behind those collections, is a larger and very long canonization process, and we can see that in this period, also in this region, we have a trans madhab attention to those collections. Before that, it was mostly a network of Shafi'i scholars. So Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, for example, he authored a mukhtasar work in Islamic fiqh, and he says, like, it is not devoted to the Hanbali madhab per se, but he says it's a mukhtasar of Islamic fiqh, and I bring, and this is rather unusual for mukhtasar works, I refer to hadith and some Quranic verses whenever I can, and those I take from Al-Bukhari, Muslim, and all the others. And this is rather unusual to have that. On the other hand, we see an increase in hadith-based works, not only like hadith collections, but the genre of the ulum al-hadith took up in this period. The famous work of Ibn Salah was read by Shafi'i scholars, but also by Hanbali and later also by Hanafi scholars. So there's a tendency that hadith became, or the reference to hadith became, a common language in the disciplines of Islamic law and Islamic creed. So and that's now the idea of the paper was, so I studied the Shafi'i networks and the Hanafi networks in later periods, and I recently got into the Hanbalis, but what was still missing is basically the Malikis or the Andalusian and Maghribi scholars, and I wanted to know what their role was, which I didn't get to it so far, unfortunately. As for the narrative strategies, why do I want to look at this? So we have a shift, an intellectual shift from like a more rationalist tendency in Damascus to a traditionalist tendency, and then we have a shift back. I could identify the schools that mostly traditionalists were teaching in, and some of the names sound familiar to you, I'm sure, but at some point the Mamluk scholars, the Mamluk Sultan or the Mamluk ruling elite, I couldn't really identify the agents here, but they exchanged the traditionalist scholars with rationalist scholars. They sent Taqiyuddin Subki with almost all his sons from Egypt to Damascus. He came with his sons-in-laws, and with the greatest network of his students. And they occupied those institutions that were formerly held by traditionalists, and then they started compiling other works than they were compiled before. So they started compiling usul fiqh works instead, and kalam works instead of like creeds that were based on Quran and Sunnah, or the ulum al-hadith genres. You can see a shift in the narrative strategies in historiographical works, such as the Tabaqat al-Shafi'iyya, which that of As-Subki focus more on law than on who heard hadith from whom. There is a lack of the reception of ulum al-hadith works that can be seen in Damascus, and a decrease of the production of traditionalist-oriented works in general. And like this is also a notion that I found, I'm not sure whether it has actually something to say, but so one can see a difference in the usage of as-salaf as-salih, and to the opposite, as-salifina min hadhihi al-ummah. So while scholars like Dhahabi, Ibn Kathir, and Ibn Taymiyyah, etc., used the concept of as-salaf as-salih, as-Subki refers to them as the salifina fil or min al-ummah. At least I believe that there's the attempt to use another language that is connoted in a different way. The possible reasons for this change can be that the traditionalist approach doesn't really or didn't really produce a stable legal system or a law that is predictable, because they're using hadith, and they often would contradict their legal reasoning when they found another hadith or contradicting hadith. And that might be more practical reasons for mostly the Mamluk ruling elite, I think, why they would change actively the scholarly network and also the intellectual climate. But this is more like speculation than a hard fact. But back to my initial idea, I wanted to see how. So we have a migration wave, that's for sure, of Andalusian and Maghribi scholars during the more rationalist phase. We have also some during the traditionalist phase, and we have some after that. Plus, we have biographical dictionaries from all three periods. And my idea is, which I unfortunately can't really proof here, is that the narrative representation in those phases might be different. I wanted to know, how do actually those scholars see them, what kind of aspects would they highlight of their scholarship, also produced works, and basically how do Maghribi and Andalusian scholars fit into those intellectual changes over time. I think I stop here, and I'm happy to get your mostly remarks and comments. Maybe someone can, for me, go with and slide.
Yes, thank you, Mohammad. It's always brave to present something that is not fully developed yet, but I'm happy that you do. And I have I think a minor question coming more from manuscript studies. The period that you're talking about, where the change is happening, is also the period where basically the whole movement or the whole phenomenon of sama'at in such manuscripts dies out. Do you connect it to this shift in personnel? Is that then another way of linking your project to something that has received wider interest in recent years?
Yeah, I have thought about that and actually discussed that with Konrad. He doesn't see it that way. Also, mostly because the sama'at were mostly produced in the Salhiyya region, and the Salhiyya region, they continue to produce this kind of scholarship. But to a certain extent, at least I believe, plus we have the Mongols who attacked Damascus around this period as well. They also destroyed and they entered the Salhiyya. They didn't get to, as far as I know, to the center of the city, but they destroyed many schools and libraries in the Salhiyya region. That might also be a factor why there is a shift. Plus, we can see actually the Cairene scholars coming to Damascus a little bit earlier, studying this material and taking it back. They take up the hadith reading sessions, but they do it in a different way, and this might be at least the reason why we have a shift. Plus, at least for Damascus, for the old city, definitely. So Stefan Leder, he says that the Subkis ended the tradition of reading sessions. Unfortunately, he doesn't give a footnote for this, So it's like, where did he get that? But it's very like that would fit very well. And you always make me nervous.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. This sounds like an exciting project, and I really hope you will have the time to do all the groundwork that will be necessary for it. I'm not sure if I'm making your life more difficult or making it easier.
You usually do.
I simply want to advertise for a great book that isn't mine, but that could be helpful in your case, Helen Pfeiffer's Empire of Salons, which I think studies an in many ways similar process because she also looks at Damascus. And she also has these new scholars coming in and people leaving Damascus to study elsewhere. And she finds reflections of these processes of change in historiography, and she finds them also in the understanding of the law.
Yeah.
What she's also interested in, that's my question to you, in is Majalis culture. So how these people socialize, how they interact through their scholarly practices with each other. Do you also see a shift in this change that you're tracing in this like actual interaction between scholars? Do we have the sources to say something about that?
So I can't say actually anything about Majalis practices during the Ayyubid and early Mamluk period in Damascus. I'm actually not aware whether or not there are manuals. If you can, like, do you know whether are there documented Majalis sessions for Damascus in this period?
Well, I don't think that we have Majalis accounts, but we do have references in biographical dictionaries. So it would be probably quite time-consuming, but you could do it similar to what Helen has done and sift through the biographical dictionaries and see what they tell us about scholarly encounters.
Yeah, but what we can definitely see is that many scholars, regardless of their they take lessons from scholars from other madaris. It's like it's a well-connected scene there, and I don't think that they might use those madhab affiliations to also get positions as qadis or something in the legal system, which was based on the fact that you have four madhab, but they really read and learned from each other. That's the thing that we can see, but interestingly, as far as I could see. For the Maghribi accounts that I went through, they weren't as connected as the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis in that period in Damascus, at least.
Thank you.
We need to shift to the next paper.
No, I just have questions. I agree with Christian that this book might be helpful to you, but I was interested in how far do you think that later hadith works can be used as sources for your own project, especially I'm thinking of those by Muhammad ibn Tulun, where he talks about these very localized strands of transmission in some of the suburbs of Damascus. If that is in any way helpful to maybe identify potential actors that you can then look for in biographical dictionaries that appeared earlier. And then a question connected to what he said, and I'm not sure if that question actually should go to him instead of you. The question about the majalis is that something that you can only trace in biographical dictionaries and so on, written at the time that you're studying, or later ones as well? With later ones, I wonder if there is not a different layer that they kind of would change the appearance of these majalis in any way. Thank you.
Probably, but they would rely on earlier sources, and then this is the interesting part of comparing narratives, right? You see how the mindset shifts and changes, and then they depict happenings and events in a different manner, and that tells us a lot about the intellectual mindset. But I can't actually. Maybe I should sit longer with with Christian, who is now in Berlin. That's good. Yeah, and Helen's book, definitely, but it's a later period, right? And later periods, I mean, what I really want to focus on is not to write a history or not to see it as a history of like a madhab or a movement. Rather, I want to see that as part of the history of the city. So what kind of, and then it really, like I can look into how Helen structured her work and what kind of sources she used, etc. But in the end, it will be a history in a different setting, different time, different period. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And so our next speaker is Suhaib.